This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at reactroundup.com/KendoUI.
Hello and welcome to React Roundup. I'm your host, Nader Dabit. Today on our show, we have Jared Palmer. Jared, welcome to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good. Today, our topic is going to be Razzle, and we're also maybe going to talk about a few of the other projects that Jared is working on over there at his company. But before we kind of get into the topic, can you give us a quick intro, kind of talking about how you got into programming and kind of how you got into open source, I guess?
Sure. So, hi, Jared Palmer. I am the lead engineer at the Palmer Group, where I spend my days building apps and services for companies that mostly have been underserved by the technological changes of the last 2 decades and building tools to automate that process. I got into programming sort of by accident. I was really into design after I graduated in school. I was going to be a banker, but that didn't quite work out. And so I started this app with a friend of mine, which is an Android app, and it was basically a content management platform for Android phones, focusing on one specific part of the phone itself, which would be the lock screen. So basically, it's not too dissimilar to Snapchat Stories. We had a SDK and Android framework, so to speak, that allowed companies and other apps to build Android lock screen applications really quickly. So that's how I sort of got my foray into first steps into programming. Although I didn't do too much of it, I was mostly on the design side of things. But in order to design cooler and cooler stuff, I ended up learning Framer.js, and that's what taught me JavaScript. That's a prototyping software. And then from there, I just started building more websites, ended up selling that company, and then I discovered React, and the rest is kind of history. It just got hooked.
So what is Razzle? I'm looking at the documentation. I have not yet used it. So I'm kind of curious, like, what's the elevator pitch for Razzle?
Create React app with server-side rendering. And not just any type of server-side rendering, specifically dynamic server-side rendering. So what does that mean? So if you look at a thing like Gatsby, which is a static site generator, Gatsby.js, that project is all about rendering the content ahead of time. And then after the output is a static HTML page, which is slightly different than Razzle's project goal, which is to be the best dynamic server rendering build toolkit out there. So a dynamic server rendering, you don't necessarily know what's going to be on the page when you visit the URL. And a good example of that is like Airbnb.com, where on a given listing, they're not really sure what's going to be there. They, based on the current tooling that exists in the universe, I'll say, statically rendering those pages ahead of time is just too much to ask considering the popularity of Airbnb. So similar to the way that WordPress generates the page on every single request, a dynamic server rendering toolkit like Razzle will do the same thing. So that's the goal. And then the flip side of that, that's like the target audience. And then the goal there was to basically make it as easy to migrate from Create React app to Razzle and add server-side rendering to your application as possible. So it uses the same CSS setup as Create React app. There's some slight differences. Unlike Create React app, in Razzle, you have access to the Webpack configuration, so you can make those changes you really want to. If you want to add a loader here or there, you can do that. So that's, I guess, one key difference. But yeah, that's basically the gist of the project. Create React app with server-side rendering.
So let's take a step back and talk about server-side rendering. I know that seems to be a pretty popular topic over the last year in the React community, adding server-side rendering to React or the React ecosystem. But what are the benefits of doing that? Is that just going back to the days of when you had a PHP page that kind of served up your application, and then when you want to visit another route, you just render the entire thing on the server? Or is this a little different? Now that we're using React, or kind of what are the benefits? Why are people even doing server-side rendering?
Sure. So even though Google's latest crawlers can evaluate JavaScript, you can see that from if you ever tried like the Lighthouse test, Google's crawlers can evaluate JavaScript. But Facebook's not so much, and neither can Twitter's. And so when you want to have really great SEO, search engine optimization, if that's important to you, high search ranking results are important to you, you need to make sure that every page has the proper title, description, and likely meta tags. Those could be like open graph tags. Open graph tags, if you're not familiar, are some meta tags in the head of the HTML document that control what gets shown on Facebook when someone shares your link, or on Twitter when someone shares your link. And that basically requires server-side rendering. And the pitch there, the thinking there is, think about what would come back if you curled the page. JavaScript, if you're putting something on the page with JavaScript and you curl that page, or that URL, you're not going to see whatever that is. And so the only way to do that, to have that curl come back with the correct titles and meta tags, is to do server rendering. And in the past, you used to in the past, you use something like Rails, where you connect directly to the database and you'd render the page with a template language. Now, React is way more powerful than any template language. And so but it takes quite a bit of configuration to make the developer experience as good as it is with just the single page application in SPA, with React. And that's where Razzle comes in. If you've heard of another framework called Next.js, it's probably the most popular. Same kind of thing, isomorphic JavaScript, universal JavaScript. That's the goal here. And using React as the view layer. Now, what's cool is with both toolkits, Next and Razzle, you don't need to think about, is this button going to work? And you don't also have to load a separate JavaScript bundle just for the client, like you would if you were using Nunjux or Handlebars or another Node.js template language. It just magically works isomorphically. And the way that happens is React is able to what's called hydrate once it renders in the server. When it gets picked up on the client, the same exact code kind of figures out, this is exactly what this application looks like. And it matches it used to match a checksum. And boom, now you're interactive on the client again. So it's kind of this interesting hybrid application where the first render gets you all the benefits of that old school Rails template kind of thing, right? Or PHP. And then from there, though, even though this is all Node, it picks up and then it acts like a single page application. And all of that's powered through Razzle. What ended up happening with Razzle, though, is after I built it, it turned out that it actually has very little to do with React. And it can be used with other. So there's examples in the Razzle repo of usage with Elm and also Reason. And it would work with Vue. It would work with Angular. Pretty much any type of JavaScript framework that has server-side rendering and client-side rendering in some way to group the two together, Razzle will work with. And the reason for that is Razzle is effectively, to get technical, is basically a thin layer around two Webpack watch tasks. One is watching the server bundle and bundling the server, and one is watching your client bundle and bundling the client, and it stays in sync. So when you make a change, both update, and there's no checksum errors. It's kind of magical in that sense. And that's basically empowers you to do whatever you want when it comes to universal JavaScript. So it's not, and also the pitch with Razzle too is that you're not buying into a framework that decides a lot about the really important things of your application. So one of the constraints was I was working on an app that was with, as soon as Next.js, this other similar project came out, I was trying to build something with Next.js, and it was probably just too early. It was like a very early adopter. And it wasn't ready yet, basically. And there were some things that I wasn't in love with, like the way the file system was also your router. It seemed kind of strange, and I just got kind of scared. So basically, Razzle's my attempt to abstract away the build system and leave all the rest of the architectural decisions to the developer. And yeah, that's basically the gist of the project.
So how do you handle routing?
So you can use React Router. If you're using React, which you don't have to, but you can use React Router. You can use React Router 3. You can use React Router 4. That's up to you, the developer. The default is a React Router server-side application. I have another project called After.js, which implements a very similar framework approach that Next.js does, but it's built on React Router instead of a custom thing that Next.js uses, and has nothing to do with the file system. but yeah, basically I use React Router, and I can get into that more if we want to go there. But yeah, that's the gist of it.
So is like the only benefit SEO type of stuff, or is there other benefits to server-side rendering?
There are some performance gains that can be had from server-side rendering, just because you can split. I mean, you can code split too. So to answer your question, the server-side rendering for Gatsby or something like that, where it's also doing that same stuff, but it's doing it ahead of time, very similar. And ultimately, it just comes down to speed, I would say. But if you're building an application and you think it's a dashboard or something like that, that's going to be that doesn't need to show up in Google, that you're going to have a marketing page that shows up in Google, and that's how people are going to get to your app, you do not need server-side rendering, and it will probably cause you a lot of headaches. Things that are really easy in a single page application can be extremely challenging in a server rendered application. Mostly data fetching is that, and so is authentication. In a server rendered application, you need to inject all your data from the top down, basically. And if you don't inject it all the way from the top down, well, then you need to render twice at the moment, where you need to render it, collect all the data, then wait for all the promises to resolve, and then somehow get it back down to where it's being requested in your component tree. Or you have to have some top level massive function that's going to resolve before you send down that data, so all your components have data. And so that just makes things, just having top down data fetching is just more difficult usually. And then also dealing with sometimes you're in a browser environment, sometimes you're in a Node.js environment, and there are differences still, even with Webpack, and that gets challenging at times as well. So yeah, those are the two gotchas. But from a performance perspective, you can do stuff like streaming rendering, where you start sending HTML down to the client as soon as possible, and that can lead to even faster like time to first bytes. And depending on if that's a constraint of your application, that can be very, very beneficial to the perception of responsiveness. Perceived performance, I'd say. So yeah, avoid it unless you have to.
That's interesting. So I'm trying to think, like, is a app that's built with Razzle, is it still considered like a single page application at that point, or is it more considered like not a single page application, or can you use like the same like concepts that we use in our normal applications? Because I always find a hard time wrapping my head around the server side stuff around React, because I haven't had an opportunity to like be in a situation where I need to build one of these apps, or I haven't had a requirement. So it's kind of like, I'm still kind of trying to understand that. And a lot of people that I've talked to also have like this similar question, like does it become like no longer a single page application at that point? Are you more like you're taking now, I guess, like the benefits that React has to offer, and then like but still using like the older model of rendering like the main part of your application on the server?
Right. So you are doing that, but the cool thing about something like Razzle is that you're not connecting to your database in some sort of view template. You're not going to go from direct to database to your view. You're going to be writing a SPA, and with a couple of changes, the developer experience is very similar to an SPA, but you get all the benefits of server-side rendering. So there are some differences, and they have to do with authentication. You need to use cookies instead of just tokens, because that's the only way your server-side requests would be able to understand how to authenticate a user. But you can fetch data in a similar fashion always. But to get it to server-side render, there's just some way you need to take some sort of external data, some sort of external object, and get it into React. And that's the like tricky thing that everyone's been trying to do in various different ways. You can do that you can start with just an object that's a route tree, and for each route you list out, like, this is the data it needs. Let's match on that route and render this. You can use some sort of tool. There are a bunch of them. There's React Resolver. You can use Apollo. You can use various other ways to manage the data and get it into that. But generally speaking, it's an SPA that just so happens to server render is the best way to describe what that experience is like. But there are definitely gotchas that keep coming up that you just need to be aware of.
Okay, cool. That explains a lot, actually. That helps me understand a lot more. So what were some of the technical difficulties kind of putting this together? And also, I guess, I'm not sure if you answered this already, but did this come out of a need that you needed within your company, that you were like building this, or you were thinking that this needs to be there for like your own use case, and then you were like, oh, like this works pretty good, let me open source it?
So basically what happened was I was working on this project for a client, and I already had, I guess, before that, had a pretty popular boilerplate project that was very like, it was just copy this and it'll work kind of thing for server side rendering. And it was and it was using some cool Webpack features to also do code splitting at the time, which is like Webpack 1 right now. But then Create React app came out, and I was like, oh, you can like reuse these, and instead of a boilerplate, you can make this like a toolkit. That's cool. And the distinction there is that you can unlike a boilerplate where you're just copying someone else's stuff, I can make a change to Razzle, and all Razzle users can get that update because it's just a package on NPM. It's just an abstraction. So between looking at Create React apps code, and then there was another project from the New York Times at the time called, or it still exists, it's called Kit, KYT. And that was also very similar. And I looked at that, and I did that for a while, but still like hadn't quite, it wasn't, I had some just opinionated opinions about stuff in Kit that was very specific to the New York Times, like the way they do styles and such, that I just didn't jive with. And so it seemed like probably should come up with something else. And so I didn't fork Kit. I basically, I don't know, it was just like a very similar approach to it, more or less. And also Create React app. And that's what sort of spawned me onto Razzle. And the big thing there was I really wanted to use React Router 4. And I really wanted control over all aspects of the project because I didn't know what my constraints were going to be like in the next few bits. And also because it was a client project, buying into a framework, and Next.js was also very young at the time. And so was Kit. That like not owning the end-to-end experience didn't seem like a smart idea. And that's kind of where I landed there. The other thing too is I already had experience with another project of mine called Backpack, which is a lot like Razzle, believe it or not. It just doesn't deal with the client bundling. It just does the backend bundling. So it's kind of like a mashup of a bunch of sort of things I had seen, worked on, liked, didn't like. And yeah, the ultimate goal was just create React app server-side rendering. And that's sort of how it came to be.
Very cool. I like the idea of it being just like a generator and just being able to spin up a brand new project that actually just works without having to do any configuration, because that's been like the hard thing for a lot of people that were getting into React before Create React app came along. I still see like some threads on Stack Overflow and I hear people talking about server rendering React applications. And I feel like they're in that same place where developers were before Create React app came along, where if you wanted to build something, like you had to do so much like setup and configuration that it was just a huge pain. And I feel like this probably just solves that pain. And the project that I was thinking about that reminded me a lot of this was what you mentioned next. But like you mentioned, it is kind of like you're not really having full control over it because a lot of the dependencies are related to that framework. Does Razzle only kind of just use normal React stuff that's in the ecosystem when someone starts this project, do they have full ownership over configuration and stuff?
Yeah, so you get full. Razzle doesn't have any runtime dependencies, so it's not running. There's no you're never going to import Razzle in your source code. You will need to reference a couple of environment variables that get injected, and that's just like paths to your assets, so you know where your CSS is going to get output to. But Razzle has no runtime dependency, and that's also a big difference between Razzle and Next. So Next is it's a framework. It has its own link. It has its own various other, it has its own data fetching stuff. Razzle is none of that. It's just a CLI tool that helps you with your Webpack configuration and basically does the heavy lifting for you, and then comes with the battery pack included. But if you want to, open up and get in there, you absolutely can manipulate every single part of Razzle, every single part of the Webpack configuration. There's a special function or special file you can create called razzle.config.js that has a function in it that you just need to, you can manipulate, called modify. And that takes in the Webpack configuration, whether it's targeting the server or the client bundle. And you can go to town, install other Webpack loaders. You can do tons of different stuff. And then you can publish that package. You can actually publish that as a package. So if you need to share your Razzle setup across other projects, you can do that. Cars.com actually has a cool one where they have their entire Razzle setup in its own package. And that's what they use to bootstrap new projects. So that's kind of cool. Much more maintainable and sustainable than having everybody kind of getting back to doing their own sort of boilerplate and just keep forking that. That doesn't quite work as well as abstracting away into a package. So yeah, that's sort of the nuts and bolts of it. Come with the battery pack included, but give you the ability to configure if you're looking for total control.
This episode is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is the hosting provider I use for devchat.tv. I also use it for my applications that manage the RSS feeds, scheduling, and sponsorships involved in delivering these shows. DigitalOcean is easy to use, has data centers all over the world, and provides terrific services including server hosting and object storage for delivering your web applications and assets quickly and easily. I use DigitalOcean because I love their interface. I get SSD storage for my servers, and their support replies quickly. So go check them out at digitalocean.com.
So I guess in your experience so far, was this what level would you say as far as complexity, kind of getting something ready like this that was ready for consumption by the average developer? Because I know a lot of times when you're building boilerplates, you have to think about opinions and how opinionated you'd like to be. I'm just kind of curious, how you came to certain decisions around that stuff, and how you came to those decisions, but also maybe what some of those decisions were around your opinionated, things that could have gone other ways that you kind of chose a certain way, I guess you'd say.
Sure. So basically, I liked a lot of the thinking of Create React app, which is that don't package anything. It's just React. It's just hello world, basically. And that's all you get. Now, I went one step further than that, I would say, is because if you do Create Razzle app, which is a package, it will give you an application with the same defaults as Create React app, basically, but plus React Router already set up for you. And that's just most likely than not. My thinking was if you're using Razzle, you're probably going to end up with, and React, you're probably going to end up with React Router anyway. And I don't do anything about data fetching. And that's where I drew the line. But I also made examples for not using React Router, using Preact, or using TypeScript, or using a handful of other common add-ons, I would say, or modifications, better word for that. And those are all in the examples directory, and you can bootstrap those as well. And so, yeah, that's I wanted to just kind of take the route of Create React, but just make very few assumptions. And what's really nice about that is it's really good for demos, because sometimes you just need to test something with server-side rendering in React, and you want to boot something up really quickly, the same way you would with Code Sandbox or Create React app. And Razzle's just like that. Very, very, it doesn't have a lot of opinions. There's no there's a Redux example, but it doesn't come with Redux or anything like that. As sort of I guess about a year or so later, I published After.js, which basically is the way I've been fetching data in my Razzle applications. And there's an example of that. But that is completely optional. And you can bootstrap that too if you want to, within one, or I think it's less than one line, one command. And so, yeah, that's sort of where my head was at, was just stay agnostic. And that's kind of the power there, is that Razzle is just the build toolkit. It's not really concerned about anything else, even doesn't care if you use React or not. And the thinking there was, with all these new tools coming out like Reason or Elm, Elm's not new, but projects like Elm and whatever is going to come next, you're probably going to want to incrementally adopt it. And if you don't have full control over the big parts of your application, like data fetching and your JavaScript framework and what Babel plugins you're using and whatever else. If you don't have complete control of some of those decisions, it could be really, really challenging to migrate and adopt or even test out what's coming next, right? So that was a big sort of constraint to me, is I want to be able to test out what comes next very quickly on an existing application. And sort of abstracting away the build toolkit from the architectural decisions of the application seemed like a way to do that.
Wow, I'm looking at your GitHub. I had no idea you had so many open source projects. Like, what's the difference between After and the main differences, I guess, between After and Razzle?
So After.js is just a handful of components. If you look at the source, it's just a handful of components. When I first released After, I actually probably copied and pasted 85% of that Razzle code into some sort of just into a basic, I would call it a fork effectively. And what I realized is that realistically, the stuff After's scope was much smaller than that. It wasn't going to replace Razzle. I basically, after a week or so, was any optimization I'm going to make to After, I'm going to want to make to Razzle. So why are they two different projects? So I reduced After scope to just be the React components and just concerned with data fetching and code splitting, and giving us a drop-in solution there that gives you a story if you want to. If you don't want to make those decisions for you, like this, I've been using this particular approach for about a year now, so it's been battle tested, and I think it's used on Coinbase.com now on some of the marketing pages and such. And so it's sort of an alternative there, just to give that a solution. But it just works with Razzle. It actually works without Razzle too. You can use After in whatever project you want. It's After is the best described, or I got the idea for After reading an article by, I forgot who it was, from Airbnb, about the way they do some of their React server-side rendering code splitting. And I read about that and I was like, oh, okay, I think I can use that in my applications. And the other thing too is that we're 100% TypeScript at the Palmer Group. So I knew that whatever solution we were going to use for code splitting, isomorphic code splitting, was going to need to work with TypeScript and was not going to be able to rely on a Babel loader to rewrite stuff or do any magic. So that was another constraint that After needed, which other solutions didn't seem to leverage at the time that when I went looking. So that's sort of the thinking behind After.
So do you all use any GraphQL at the Palmer Group? And if, and this I guess is a separate question, how do you work with GraphQL on a server side or a server rendered app? Does that even does that work the same way as it would on a client app, or is that something people do even?
So it's a good question. So we don't use GraphQL in production. I use it on a couple side projects, but basically, yes, you can use GraphQL with server-side rendering. The catch is the way Apollo works is it actually walks your entire tree and then looks at all your just static analysis and then ends up pulling out all the data, making one request, and then sending it back down, kind of in the way I described earlier. I don't remember. I think Apollo ends up walking your rendering twice, basically, because it has to walk your whole tree and it does it recursively. So that can be a performance hit, but also because you're blocking rendering until all your data is fetched. You can, that's sort of, the part of the GraphQL story there. We don't use GraphQL. We're experimenting with it right now. I actually was going to may give a talk at a meetup, at the GraphQL meetup, called Almost GraphQL, which is basically the way we have gotten around, I will say, using it, or how some applications probably you can get a lot of the benefits if you make some architectural decisions about mostly your backend. So our backends are in Java, and because Java is a statically typed language, and because of the way that the frameworks, our backend frameworks work, we get perfect Swagger documentation basically for free. And we leverage that perfect Swagger documentation to code gen, to generate SDKs for our APIs. So what does that mean? We just run this command that analyzes all the Swagger responses and all the documentation and spits out a perfect JavaScript SDK for our client, for their APIs, and it produces perfect TypeScript types. And so if we have a change in the API and we rerun the code gen, we can just look at the TypeScript errors and we see that there. And we kind of forked Swagger code gen. Ours is based on Axios. So we have our favorite data fetching tool, wraparound fetch. And yeah, it's just basically having an SDK to your own application. We don't test fetches anymore. So it's not like we don't mock fetch requests on the client. It's just not something we need to do anymore because we know it's perfect every time. And there are also some cool abstractions that we're able to make because a lot of our APIs have very similar structures to them. And so because like all of our CRUD endpoints work identically the same way, we actually can do some interesting stuff with caching similar entities basically in a normalized cache. So not too dissimilar to the way that Apollo caches its requests and queries and responses and data internally. We have a similar thing that does that kind of caching, and we also have written out query similar components to Apollo's new query components, where these are render props where you pass in the parameters and to this component, and it spits back out a render prop with data loading error. And so you get that same kind of query component utility and flexibility without GraphQL. And so the two of those factors combined is why I like to call it like almost GraphQL, because while definitely overfetching can be something we always need to watch out for, and one of the things we don't get because we don't get the benefit of, it's a decent workflow, I'll say. We are experimenting with GraphQL.
No, that sounds really
it's kind of
interesting. It sounds like you have a pretty sophisticated like workflow that actually sounds like it simplifies everything and does a lot of the work for you. I really like how you were saying that it creates the types for you for TypeScript. I know that you know it's kind of like a pain sometimes, but also the API generation based on your Swagger documentation, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, the TypeScript types, you can do this GraphQL. You can generate TypeScript types. I believe there's Apollo code gen. So we'd end up doing that anyway. The other big constraint for us right now is this is going to be controversial. We don't use null in our JavaScript. Just avoid it. So GraphQL null is a very big part of GraphQL. So we would definitely need to write some sort of function to coalesce that and remove null and replace it with undefined. We use undefined to represent emptiness pretty much at all times. So other parts of it that are I guess custom, but no, you're totally right. It's a workflow, I would say. And TypeScript powers all of it. It would not be, if we didn't use TypeScript, I would never feel confident using this kind of workflow. We also have been using TypeScript for over a year now on all of our projects. So I would say we have 95% type coverage, and the 5% are all external libraries, not mission critical. So, it's kind of crazy. You can just make a change in the API, run the code gen, and just fix the errors, and you have complete confidence that you've updated the application to the latest version, and you're good to go. But that's only because we have perfect types. I couldn't even imagine how we would do that there are changes we've made to applications, sweeping changes that I don't think we would have attempted had we not had TypeScript types for almost everything.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, I'd love to talk to you about some of the stuff we're working on at AWS, maybe some AppSync stuff offline one day, and kind of just walk you through some of the managed GraphQL stuff we have going on, just so you're aware of it. And if you ever had an opportunity that you wanted to kind of try it out, on a prototype or something, you could check it out.
No, yeah, I would love to. We are working on a couple projects. I have 2 or 3 side projects that are using Apollo on the client, and then one of them is using Urkel, Ken's library. But yeah, it's something we're definitely looking into, just because with GraphQL you get all these benefits of sort of partitioning your application as well. Certainly, slicing and dicing stuff seems like it'd be easier. Collaborating with multiple people, it just seems like it makes a lot of sense. But we'll get there. I think it's the future.
Are you writing your own GraphQL servers?
We probably will. What I think the way we'll do it is we will allow our APIs to accept a list of IDs, and then we'll probably put up a node server to prototype in front of it that will use data loader to batch those requests out. Just 'cause I think that's how I think we'll prototype with it, and we'll stand up some sort of little node server, and then it won't be extremely efficient, but it will work. And so yeah, we'll use like data loader to hit our API and with a batch query basically for a given resource, I think. There are also some concerns that we've had about how complex permissions work in GraphQL. We definitely something I would love to talk to you offline about, but just having a large number of complicated permissions matrix that we sometimes have on certain applications could get hairy. But maybe it's possible. I'm not sure. We may end up having multiple endpoints or some sort of configuration system there. I'm not sure. We still have yet to explore that, but that's one of the things that we need to like get deep on before we can proceed, I think, from my like understanding of the problem. But the other thing we're thinking about too is if we do end up liking it, is because we're in static type land in Java. There's this discussion of, well, if we're supporting both REST and GraphQL, maybe you have some insight into this. Are you REST first or are you GraphQL first from a developer perspective? And you kind of need to pick one, it seems like. And so there's also some client constraints with that. Sometimes they still need to support REST APIs. So yeah, that's just sort of where my head's at on the subject. I don't know, have you found people transitioning towards more GraphQL first versus like REST first, where they're trying to do both?
That's an interesting question because like in the GraphQL community and a lot of the blog posts and the talks you hear about GraphQL, the assumption is everything is GraphQL. But in the real world, a lot of the successful applications that are running that want to try GraphQL are not going to be able to transition all the way to GraphQL. They just have too much legacy APIs and stuff like that. At least, at first, maybe down the road, it's possible to transition all the way. Also, there's just so many different circumstances around everyone's applications and around their use cases that it's kind of rare that you can just completely replace your REST endpoints with GraphQL right away. It's something that can be done probably in every app given the right amount of time. But in reality, if something's working, it's really a tough decision to convince everyone in your company that you want to just throw that away and replace it with GraphQL just for the hell of it, and stuff like that. So most of the actual real world use cases that I've seen, at least, if you're starting a greenfield project, of course, it's a lot easier to go all the way GraphQL. But what I've seen actually is a combination of both REST and GraphQL. And then that kind of goes back to how you implement GraphQL. And if you look at some of the clients like Apollo, a lot of times the way that the data is fetched and the way that you're accessing the data is like by component if you're using those higher components. But a lot of times you need that data available elsewhere in your application as well. So you kind of have to start thinking about, do you want to use something more along the lines of a GraphQL fetch API where you can actually just work with Redux and MobX or whatever your state management library is. I think that would be a good blog post or something like that, for someone to kind of do some case studies on and talk to some companies and talk about their experience. Maybe I can kind of see if I can do something like that because, yeah, in reality, rarely can you go all the way GraphQL on a legacy or an existing brownfield application, and even on a brand new application. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, because maybe you don't really need it for certain use cases. I would say there's not a clean answer for that question.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things where maybe because we live in because again I mentioned before we had really structured APIs. And we have some population. Let's take an example, like a simple entity that has tags. We would already have it as tag IDs in the list of IDs. If we went to GraphQL, we could make some rule maybe where if it ends with IDs, we even know to expand it. And maybe there's some cool static analysis we could do on our Java stuff to automatically generate the likely GraphQL endpoints and stuff there. But yeah, I was just sort of curious to see like, yeah, if we have a app that is very REST heavy, that migration process, it seems like nobody really knows. What I have learned, at least with my research, is that there are some things you can mess up with GraphQL. If you do pagination wrong from the beginning, you'll be sad. That's sort of what I've gathered, is that like there's definitely some conventions that are probably worth sticking to. I don't know. What are your thoughts there?
Well, you mentioned authorization earlier. One of the things that we're focusing like heavily on actually is making the authorization use case something that's fairly trivial, because it's not an easy problem to solve. And a lot of the, and when you're building your own GraphQL server, it's actually pretty complex to get that right and actually have it, secure. So like, when you're working with these managed services like Firebase or AppSync or whatever, I think the advantage that we're seeing like customers that are using it, that are liking about it, is like we have like, we have teams of people that are like super experienced and have seen all of these issues, and they're kind of, you're getting all of this expertise, like, and you have like a pre-built solution. So like with authorization and stuff like that, yeah, let's talk about that, and I can kind of show you kind of what we're doing. And I think that like when you're talking about different roles, I think is that kind of what you're saying, and you want to only allow access to certain endpoints or certain.
Yeah, some stuff's like only read only, some stuff's going to be, and then there's some that's read only but not updatable, and then there's all those kinds of crazy stuff that business illogic, if you will, right. That happens when you have complex applications, and figuring that out for ourselves has been interesting.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know if there's the best way to do that, but yeah, somebody who figures out that kind of thing would be, that would be awesome. And definitely, staying dry and keeping things properly abstracted, I think, is important too in those kinds of situations where you're not talking directly to the database in your resolver, for example. Those kinds of abstractions we've sort of picked up in our experimentation. But yeah, very curious about that. I don't know. Hopefully, I think, how old is GraphQL? I don't know, 5 years, 6 years old.
Yeah, at the most.
Yeah. So hopefully there'll be some best practices that form. But very cool. Yeah, it's all very, very, very cool stuff. 2 of our team members came from American Express, and they are very familiar with Relay and Relay Modern. So, and that's obviously very, very popular too. Although I think less so than Apollo at this point. But I'm sure they've been pushing for that for some different stuff. So it's been cool to hear them talk about that.
Well, it looks like we're kind of getting close on time. Is there anything else that you wanted to kind of discuss before we go ahead and get to the picks?
No, I just this has been awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I've learned a lot. I was like thinking, because we had Jared on at the React Native Radio podcast a couple of weeks ago. Maybe it's been a month ago now. And I was thinking like, we're going to be talking about the same stuff, but here we are like, I just am now realizing how much other stuff he's also done other than Formic, because we talked about Formic. So nice. Like completely different stuff. So it's pretty cool. I guess I'll go ahead and do a pick first, and then I'll go ahead, I guess, and let you get to your pick.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
All right. So my pick is Proton Native. It's a way to create native desktop applications using React. It's pretty cool. If you already know React or React Native, it's kind of really easy to pick up. So you can pretty much start building desktop apps fairly quickly. And I think it's a pretty new library. I just heard about it like a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure. I'm looking at the repo now. It looks like it's been out, or at least it looks like the first commit was like 3 months ago. So I'm not sure if it was released then or if it's been just recently released. But yeah, it's really cool, Proton native. And that's it. That's my only pick for today. Jared, do you have any picks?
Yeah, so my 2 picks, hold on, my internet is a little shaky right now. My 2 picks, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So
yeah,
my 2, all right, so my 2 picks, first one is Guess.js on GitHub, which is, the title goes, Libraries and Tools for Enabling Data-Driven User Experiences on the Web. Something that's come out from, I think, Google, and the gist of it is they're doing really cool stuff with using machine learning based on your Google Analytics data to do stuff like prefetching and bundle loading and other crazy, crazy stuff. So that seems pretty cool and definitely something to check out and keep an eye on. The other one is I saw this Zendesk release their component library, their React component library called Garden. And it takes a really interesting approach. It offers like these concept of like a container, which is the component's logic, an element, which is basically the defaults that your default use cases, and then the primitive, which is like the view, like the dumbest presentational component. I think it's really interesting to see that sort of in React. So you have like button container, button view, and then button. The container has like all the accessibility stuff, and then the view is the colors, and that's really customizable. And then the default is the element itself, and that's the combination of the two. But what's cool is by exposing the primitive and then like the container, which is the logic part of it, you can swap stuff out, because if the containers are just responsible for just the logic and they give back render control, then the sky's the limit. You could potentially share, just get a lot out of those special situations when you need that extra layer of customization. It kind of like really flows with a lot of my philosophy, which is build things with a battery pack included, but then give people the ability to open up the hood and get their hands dirty. So yeah, check out the Garden by the team at Zendesk. Very, very cool.
Wow, this is my first time hearing about that. I'm checking it out now. This would be really cool for React Native also. I was thinking. Yeah.
I think it's built with styled components, so very opinionated in that sense. But because again, the container like view element, which I've never heard it described that way before, but that sounds good to me. You should be able to swap out some of the views with your own styles. I'm sure, adopting that in React Native will be something that someone will do. But yeah, I'm really excited to play with some of this stuff.
All right. Well, Jared, thanks for coming on and talking with us today. Really enjoyed it. So that wraps up this episode of React Roundup. Thanks for listening, and we'll see everyone next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com.